As so often happens several months after proposing a topic to present on, I'm not going to be talking specifically about what I proposed, what appears in the program. My topic today, however, did emerge from that project regarding digital public writing and experiential learning professional writing courses. Today, I'm going to talk a little about my previous experiences with service learning and community writing and challenge the normative spatial arrangement of community writing projects in general. What I'm most interested in exploring is in what community has come to mean in community writing scholarship and research. That is, community seems synonymous with off-campus, or as Paula Matthew refers to it in Tactics of Hope, the streets. My intention is not to dismiss off-campus contributions to community writing as a field, for I value that work. I do some of that work. Rather, my goal here is to point to a gap in our work and ask, why do we appear to privilege off-campus communities over on-campus communities? My first experience with community writing began in the fall of 2003 as a second-year master's student teaching a composition course at Northern Michigan University. During my first year, I had done some reading about service learning, and I was interested in possibly incorporating some experiential learning projects. Coincidentally, my friend Heidi Stevenson, who I had known since we were undergrads at NMU, was finishing up her PhD at IUP, and she was designing a study of service learning in first-year composition. She wanted to return to the area and hoped to conduct the study at NMU. We talked about my interest, and she asked me to teach the course. Of course, the thought of me teaching my third section of composition ever as a service learning course was more than a little bit intimidating. But Heidi took on the responsibility of making community connections, lining up partners, and visiting service sites with students while I would design the course, including the reflective writing and class discussions. I also had the support of Tom Dean's textbook, Writing and Community Action. Students worked with several partners, for example, creating brochures, participating in youth mentoring programs, conducting after-school literacy tutoring, and attending a young mother support group. Service learning then became my area of expertise in rhetoric and composition without yet knowing a great deal about rhetoric and composition. And my service learning courses also became the basis for my master's thesis. In returning to my thesis 13 years later, I see the threads that connect my occasional community writing projects, but more importantly, I saw how I seemed to be pushing beyond the ways service learning and community writing were defined as off-campus. So here's my claim. Community writing as a field appears to focus predominantly on communities outside the campus walls, and in doing so, I believe, we're missing valuable opportunities to engage with and even build community inside the campus walls. Where we are and where we've been, in brief. Take, for instance, the 2016 4C statement on community-engaged projects in rhetoric and composition. Quote, "We define community-engaged projects as scholarly, teaching, or community development activities that involve collaborations between one or more academic institutions and one or more local, regional, national, or international community groups and contribute to the public good." This very recent statement echoes Tom Dean's sentiment in his 2003 book, Writing Partnerships. He connects community outreach to Aristotle's rhetoric, which, quote, "was intended, after all, not to help students succeed in school settings, but rather to equip rhetors to intervene in public spheres," end quote. For Deans, students can use service learning projects to explore social issues and contribute to local organizations. And going back a bit before Dean's work to 1999 and the National Association of State Universities and land-grant colleges white paper, Returning to Our Roots, the Engaged Institution, it defines community as having, quote, "many different definitions extending from the neighborhood in which the campus is located to the world," end quote. So what we're seeing is that anything beyond the campus walls can count as community. Two problems driving off-campus community engagement. This drive to get students involved off-campus makes sense, however, when we consider two key problems identified within higher education. First, the perennial civic lack of younger generations of students. They're said to not know how to be civically engaged, or even know that they should care to be civically engaged, or they simply care about, quote, democratic things, end quote, that don't really matter in the right ways, such as voting for your favorite music video. We can find this first problem identified in Campus Compact's 1999 President's Declaration on the Civic Responsibility of Higher Education. As Battistoni in 2002 explains, the civic missions of higher education were to combat civic disengagement and foster student civic engagement in a diverse democracy. That is, Americans were feeling more powerless than ever before, well, 20 years ago that is, and the downward trend in voting was a major measure of apathy. And further, higher education needed to do more to address the problem by returning, quote, to the earliest mission of educating citizens for democracy and liberty, end quote. And that's from Battistoni. Battistoni goes on to cite other disturbing findings in studies of youth political disengagement. For example, a 2000 Higher Education Research Institute study found political engagement being at an all-time low despite it having been an election year. Further, Battistoni is concerned that, quote, young people seem to be joining less and identifying less with matters indicative of public engagement, end quote. Frankly, reading in this particular chapter, which he titles Evidence of a Crisis in a Democratic Civic Education, is disconcerting because 15 years later, we hear much the same thing about today's young people. In addition to observations that young people appear less engaged, and at the time of Campus Compact's call for civic engagement in higher education, the National Association of State Universities and land-grant colleges asserted a second problem. Quote, we face a growing frustration with what is seen to be our unresponsiveness. At the root of the criticism is a perception that we are out of touch and out of date. What these complaints add up to is a perception that, despite the resources and expertise available on our campuses, our institutions are not well organized to bring them to bear on local problems in a coherent way, end quote. And the idea that campuses need to be engaged with local problems stems, they argue, from the development of land-grant colleges and their missions to address the needs in agriculture, rural development, mining, engineering, and the need for military officers, end quote. We can find evidence of these views regarding young people's lack of civil engagement and the argument for the civic value of service learning in Thomas Huckin's 1997 article, Technical Writing and Community Service. The problem he finds is that he couldn't find any technical or professional writing teachers who seemed aware of service learning, which, as we know, requires reflective writing and an emphasis on civic awareness that other community writing projects of the time did not. In light of this, he recommends 3 goals for these types of projects. Quote, 1, helping students develop their academic skills, in this case writing. 2, helping students develop more civic awareness. And 3, helping the larger community by addressing the needs of local nonprofit agencies, end quote. Taken all together, it's clear in looking at these goals that the assumptions are students were lacking civic awareness and that service off campus was a method of addressing the problem of civic disengagement. These early ideas about students' lack of civic engagement still appear to drive community writing projects today. For the purposes of a brief conference presentation like this, I want to move on to what I've discovered in my examination of our research and scholarship of service learning and community writing. If you'd like to learn more about my on-campus community writing projects, there are handouts and examples of the students' projects on the table. As a starting point, and this is a project in its early stages, I limited my scope to searching one of our 2 journals that focus on community writing, Reflections, Public Rhetoric, Civic Writing, and Service Learning. The other, of course, is the Community Literacy Journal. I looked at all 16 volumes and 32 issues. My approach included reading titles and abstracts, and then scanning each article, reading some more deeply than others. I knew that I was interested in on-campus versus off-campus service learning and community writing projects, so I started with these 2 categories and then developed other categories you can see in this slide. There were a total of 193 articles, excluding, for example, student essays about their personal experiences post-Katrina and poetry and artwork. I wasn't surprised to find that most focused on off-campus community writing, 72.5%. Or that relatively few focused on on-campus community writing. This accounted for just 6.3% of the articles. What these preliminary findings show is that the field of community writing has diverse interests, yet we also see that those interests tend to be off-campus. As I've discussed earlier, there are clear reasons why this might be the case, but have we, in community writing, explicitly addressed on-campus service learning and community writing projects. I can only find one mention of it in Reflections. We can find it in Tom Dean's 2003 interview with Bruce Herzberg. Herzberg describes on-campus service learning projects as, quote, quasi-service learning, end quote. And he explains that, quote, these projects achieve some of the effects of true service learning, end quote. Even though he leaves the door open for on-campus service learning and writing projects, that door is also half closed because these projects are not true service learning. Perhaps this attitude explains why on-campus community writing projects are mostly absent from our scholarship. To end, at the University of Tennessee, Chattanooga, I've heard students' desire for deeper connections to their campus, and I've seen the positive effects of students becoming more engaged in their campus community through writing for that community. There are many valuable projects and issues through which we can help our students learn to become more active citizens in their own campus communities. We might draw from events on college campuses nationwide in the past year, such as protests at Berkeley and Evergreen. During the 2016 presidential campaign, chalk drawings and erasing them put UTC's campus in the national spotlight. Students might examine free speech on campus and make a positive impact by informing their peers and influencing the administration regarding laws and policies, and perhaps even spur change. Given these examples and my own experience working with the Teaching and Learning Garden, I hope that we can come to see our campuses as real communities that can offer us sites to do true service learning and community writing. These students then have the potential to transfer these values and practices to their off-campus communities and the off-campus communities of others.